So welcome everybody. We
Hello.
just wondered if there's a universal green welcome, because we would say kia ora or good day or hi.
Howdy.
We are New Zealanders, we are Canadians, we are Germans by birth. So universal greetings, everybody. We are located on the traditional territories of the Coast Salish, off the west coast of Canada, near Vancouver Island. And we are so happy to be connected in this way to greens around the world.
We were supposed to be in Korea right now.
Yeah, it was supposed to be Korea, and I doubt whether we would have made that. So so it's good to be online.
Okay. So
we have some postings in the chat, and whatever you post in the chat, this is just housekeeping stuff. It will be compiled and posted after the session so that everybody can read the postings. If you don't want your posting to be in that compilation at the end, please let us know, either by email or in the chat, and we'll take that out before it's posted. Also, what will be posted after the session are the findings of this workshop. I know in another workshop yesterday, the findings were entered into a slide. We're going to do it slightly differently, but either way, you are going to receive all the information that will come out of this workshop. Question and answer. We posted something about adaptation. We'll get there in a moment. I'm wondering if there's any more housekeeping before we begin.
No, let's just try and run with it.
Sabina will try and handle the chat, and I will try and handle the initial presentations. The way this is going to, we're hoping to structure this is that there will be an introduction into the deep adaptation concept with a few slides, which incidentally will be posted as well and distributed to you, but only after the session. And then there'll be some activities with breakout rooms, depending on how many people there are. Yeah, we'll structure that accordingly. And then a general discussion that can go on for quite some time. We've got 2 hours, and our agenda will not take all of that up. So we're relying on you, valued participants, to structure the agenda, at least in part.
Yeah, I think we made up our mind yesterday when we said that we would like to have more time with the speakers and the presenters and the participants, and so we left a little bit more time, so not to rush through the whole presentations, but also time for in-between questions. Yeah. Is that all right?
Yeah. So please
let us know.
If you don't want to post a question in the chat, I'm happy to be interrupted. We both have been teaching for more decades than we care to think about, so interruptions are not a problem for us. And in fact, it makes the agenda more lively.
More interactive, the better.
So just raise your hand, and hopefully I'll notice sooner or later, and that'll be that. Another item is that the session includes a handout, a 2-page hard copy document that is attached, and it would help if you could download that, not necessarily for printing, but if you could have it on a screen somewhere. That will be important, especially for the breakout activities, but also on that handout, there will be much of the content that you will see on the slides will also be there. So there's no need for anybody to scribble down a lot of notes. It's probably better if you just listen and engage in the agenda. There's an icebreaker question. And
since we're in Canada.
Yeah. So we're breaking a lot of ice up here. And we found some of those questions rather funny, but the one that I found fit this topic most is What book or film have you seen lately that has caught your interest? And I don't know if you can also see the answer that we posted. The answer was, don't look up. And we're hoping that at least some of you have seen that film. It really impressed us. The reason why we thought this was an interesting stimulant is that it makes people think about this time period that we're in, the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is the era starting about mid-20th century, where the processes in the biosphere are mostly governed by and influenced by human activities. In other words, we're not just the dominant species on Earth, but we're basically running the workings of the planet. And that has some very serious implications for us and everybody else who lives on this planet. So from our view, it is justified to give this new era a name, its own name, and that is the Anthropocene. If you Google the word, there's lots and lots already published on it. So that is part of the context for this workshop, the Anthropocene. Deep adaptation only works and only becomes relevant in the context of the Anthropocene. Now, on the question and answer, I asked an initial question, adaptation. The word is familiar, and everybody who's learned about evolution in school probably also has heard the word adaptation. But deep adaptation is something quite different, as we will see shortly. And so this is just a bit of a stimulating question to direct you towards what will come up in a few slides' time. Are there any questions so far in the chat?
No, I'm just going to put a link to the Anthropocene here.
Okay. I will start slide sharing. And go. All right. What you see there on the left is one of the background documents, and they're actually posted in the chat as well. This is an online textbook of human security. And the concept of human security will be quite central to this workshop, in addition to things like adaptation and Anthropocene. Human security is a model of security that the UN has adopted quite widely since the mid-90s. And it has informed a lot of United Nations policies and programs. Human security involves economic security, health-related security, environmental security, and socio-political security, including the traditional international military law enforcement and all of those things. So it's a very inclusive concept, but it's also totally human-centered. Human security has nothing to do with states. It is totally centered on the human individual, human rights and needs, and to what extent they are accommodated. And human security, basically, when people express their human security and their feelings about it, it basically states how well they're doing. Anyway, this is a textbook. It's online, it's free, it can be downloaded by everybody. We have used it in our teaching for, well, a couple of years now. It's an edited work with contributions by about 20 authors around the world. And so feel free to have a look at that at any time. The link will stay. Well, we hope. We're starting with a definition of deep adaptation. After all, you're probably curious, and this may have attracted you to this workshop at all, this concept. And the term deep adaptation is not yet widely known. It came from a particular researcher, Jem Bendell, at the University of Cumbria in the UK, and it has since, well, it's gained some recognition, but this has only proceeded over the last couple of years. So this is something that is still making an impact. We're going to rely quite heavily on Bendell's presentation. After all, he's sort of the father of this concept, deep adaptation. We've had some thoughts of our own on it, especially in the context of human security, which is our area, a main area of professional activity. So we're quite on board. And we're not going to advocate for it, but we're going to try and introduce it to you for you to make up your own mind to what extent deep adaptation is actually relevant to green policy making and green governance. And we're going to address that question towards the end of the workshop. So here we have it, deep adaptation, an ethos, a framework, and a movement, all in one, if you believe that. An ethos, so that has to do with values, right? Values, attitudes, ideals, aspirations that address this cluster of crises that we're facing in the Anthropocene. And we're not going to go into what these crises are. You've heard enough about it, from pollution to overconsumption to hunger. A lot of the things that the Sustainable Development Goals are trying to address, that is the polycrisis. A framework for policy deep adaptation is also designed to help people design countermeasures. We'll learn more about that in a minute. Jem Bendell's favorite phrase here is making the future less worse. And what that means, you will hear in a few seconds. And finally, it's a movement. Deep adaptation has been interpreted as a movement by many people, meaning it is something that informs individual action, individual aspirations, and it is not without controversy, deep adaptation. There are some critics who are quite vociferous. Anyway, this is what this definition means. And most importantly, what makes it stand out is that under deep adaptation, we're accepting a certain amount of collapse. We're accepting the fact that things are not going to go our way in every respect, the way they have over the last couple of centuries. We've really been ruling the planet more or less as a species. This is not going to go on forever. Nothing goes on forever. Certainly growth doesn't go on forever, and our growth has been spectacular. So we can expect that things will slow down, to some extent, perhaps even nosedive, and there will be some limited collapse. That is something that under deep adaptation, we work as an assumption, but a lot of people are not comfortable with that assumption. So this is one point where the critics focus on. It is not shallow adaptation like green development, where we're just hoping for everything to get better for everybody. We consider that unrealistic and not helpful for green policy design. It is transformative, meaning we are actually aiming at policies that transform the human situation on this planet into a different one. Things cannot go on as we currently are trying. I'm hoping that at least among ourselves here at this workshop, we can agree on that the status quo is unsustainable in many respects. So that's what transformative means. And nothing lasts forever. I think I said it before. There's some Buddhism in there that also a lot of people implicitly recognize as a truth. And we're focusing on the future. We're not focusing on the present. The one thing that perhaps that annoys us most about the daily news is that so many people in political leadership positions still assume that the status quo extends forever into the future if we only do things right. Well, no,
business as usual.
Business as usual just is not going to go on. So that's what deep adaptation means. Hang on. There's a bit of a lag here in my cursor. Okay. This is the center point of deep adaptation. Jim Bendel summarizes it under these 4 R's, as he called them. There's a lot of R's in sustainability, especially when you're in education, with school kids can recite R's ad nauseum, restore, replace, rethink, reuse, and all of those. But these are different ones, these 4 R's. They basically circumscribe what deep adaptation means in terms of agenda. So resilience, I think that term has made the media by now. How do we keep what we really want to keep? He phrases these 4 agenda in terms of questions, because the questions make people think. Most characteristically for deep adaptation is the second one, relinquishment. We have to get rid of things in order to transform our situation into a more sustainable one. What beliefs and norms do we need to let go of in order not to make matters worse? And this is all what deep adaptation is about, is what do we need to do in order not to make matters worse? And Bendel even phrases it as making things less worse, which is stylistically awful, but it does include the realization of limited collapse. Things are going to get worse in some respects for many people. But what can we do to make them less worse, to avoid the worst possible outcomes? That's what deep adaptation aims at. Restoration, there are quite a lot of values and traditions and practices that a lot of people used to engage in and no longer under modernity. And some of them would actually helpful. It would be helpful if we brought them back. So that's restoration. And reconciliation, we like that as people in human security, yes, because there are a lot of things on this planet that humanity needs to make peace with. And that's not just peace with each other, and there's lots of need for that, but also peace with every other living being on the planet and the entire biosphere, which at the moment we are quite at war with. We need, there's a definite need for peacemaking there. So those are the 4 agenda. I think my keyboard is, there we are. And then it switches.
Oh, okay.
Okay, right.
It jumps.
Reasons. And these include reasons for this workshop. Why do we bother with this idea of deep adaptation? There are a lot of trends in the Anthropocene that should give reason for concern, and negative trends mostly in terms of climate change, in terms of pollution, in terms of a whole lot of other things. And our chances improve if we engage with them and if we don't just turn away and ignore them. what negative predictions are available, they're hardly ever revised towards the positive. In fact, negative predictions tend to become worse. And the reason for that is this ecological overshoot. That is a very Googleable term, but in essence, what it means is that humanity's ecological footprint exceeds what the planet can sustainably deliver. The numbers that are bandied about range around 160 to 170% at the moment. And that is our overshoot. In other words, we're using 70% more resources from the biosphere than the biosphere can sustainably provide for us. There are a number of reasons why this number keeps going up, why our overshoot keeps getting worse every year. You may have heard about World Overshoot Day and all sorts of other models that limit that. The Stockholm Sustainability, Stockholm Resilience Center has come up with a model of 9 planetary boundaries, and 5 of them are now transgressed. The latest one only a few weeks ago when the publication came out. Anyway, there are a number of ways of presenting and picturing this overshoot. It is quite real, even though there are a lot of people, some of them quite close to us, who are still trying to ignore it or somehow refute it. But ignoring overshoot just makes it harder to address the problems, we think. Deep adaptation provides some help addressing it. And there is that prospect of collapse on which deep adaptation is based. But it does impress on people that normal is not what it used to be, if you want to put it like that, right? And a return to normal, which is what people hope for in the wake of the pandemic, well, it's not going to be the same normal as before. As long as you're okay with that, all right, return to normal, maybe, but not in every respect. The opposition to deep adaptation often comes from interests that are less than honorable. So the critics, they may focus on the prospect of collapse and say, oh, this is doom and gloom, and we don't want to engage with that. But underneath their interests often are something quite selfish. If you think of parties like the fossil fuel companies, who, for whom deep adaptation is, of course, a no-go. There are vested interests in their critique. And quite often, if you dig a little bit deeper, you find them. And the last reason, not sure how serious you take that, but militaries and insurance companies are actually already preparing for collapse scenarios. So the assumption of partial collapse is not totally out of this world. There are a lot of professionals, people who are in the business of knowing the future to a certain extent, who acknowledge that and plan for it. And with the insurance companies, it's in their business interest to actually plan for that because it's so likely. In the first, I forgot to mention the very first point here, smarter. What we mean by smarter means merely wiser and perhaps a little bit more perceiving the real world and its prospects in order to head off the worst possible outcomes. So that's what we mean by smartness. And collapse, prospect of collapse, really means fixing things that most likely will be broken. Right? That's what deep adaptation is about. facing and dealing with the prospect of collapse.
Do you want to take some questions, or do we do?
Well,
keep them.
is there something in the chat that we need to engage with at this point?
Diane was saying, is this for individual or collective action?
Okay, excellent question, Diane.
Because that fits sort of into
We would,
thing.
my first reaction would be both.
Yes.
And probably quite to equal extent. Because, well, as Greens, we like to refer to the collective. We don't buy into the North American modernist individualism, where everybody is sort of on their own, trying to make ends meet and pursue personal happiness. Well, of course, there is that. We are autonomous individuals, in some cultures more, in some cultures less. But collective action, especially under the green heading, I think is just as important. And when it comes to deep adaptation and the 4 agenda, the 4 questions that we hope you still remember, they refer to collective action as much as to individual decision making, I think. Any other questions at this point?
How can we adapt to a 4 degrees world?
Adapting to a 4-degree world. So this refers to a particular aspect of partial collapse, namely climate. And 4 degrees warming, quite a bit more than the envisioned 1.5 degrees, envisioned by IPCC and a lot of policymakers, probably has become unattainable now in view of the continued failure of the COP meetings. So 4 degrees is not unreasonable as a possibility to consider. Well, of course, we're all hoping it won't come about, but 4 degrees is a possibility. And that represents an aspect of limited collapse that we better face just in case, because it increases our resilience if it really comes about, facing it now. So how could we adapt? Well, there is a fair bit of literature out there on that kind of physical adaptation. Of course, it is mostly collective at this point. This refers to policy design, refers to new security models, and human security deals with that kind of adaptation as well. The 4 pillars of economic security, socio-political, environmental, health-related security. There are some ramifications on in those 4 areas that all have to do with adapting to a 4-degree warmer world. I'm not sure to what extent we should get deeper into that, even though it does constitute deep adaptation. It's perhaps a little bit too specialized for the sake of this workshop. Anything you would like to add to that?
Well, I think I would not like to go to the most extreme at this point in time, because it is already very difficult to imagine a 4 degrees warming and what life would look like, even though we do have models for it. But at this point in time, I think for the global Greens, it is more important to say, let's try to stay under 1.5, and how can we possibly accomplish that? Yeah. 4 degrees like to see it. is quite a long way towards that nightmare scenario of hothouse Earth, which we're all well, we find it utterly terrifying, and as a situation of no return, and might even spell extinction of our own species, but certainly a global catastrophe of unprecedented extent. So this hothouse Earth scenario, the trouble with it is that the tipping point that will trigger it off is unknown. We may have already passed it, we may not. So the 4 degree world is
sort of a notch below that, but it may already be beyond that tipping point, meaning the 4-degree world is merely a stage in the transition towards hothouse Earth.
And I think we can cover this perhaps under the last point about militaries preparing for such scenarios.
There comes a point when even military planning is pointless. And 4-degree worlds may well be within that range.
So this would be a good point for discussion later on.
Anyway, the next slide describes a bit more in terms of planning for scenarios. If I can make my slides work. That's funny, there's this, sorry about, okay, here we are, next slide, 5. Approaches, what can we do? And planning for the 4-degree world is part of this. But of course, there's a whole lot more what can be done and is being planned under deep adaptation by various people. Most of all, I would think, Green parties and their associates. As educationists, I'm distinguishing these points in terms of learning, what has to be learned and how could it be learned, but there's no particular order to these. Part of the beginning towards deep adaptation is to make people recognize that we're an overshoot, to make people understand the 4 agenda, those 4 questions that encompass what deep adaptation is about, and then proceed on to what can be done in those directions.
Would you have some examples for collapse when it comes to that?
Other than the 4-degree world?
Yeah.
Well, we're seeing a fair bit of collapse in the North American Midwest, where the sequence of storms is now almost uninterrupted. Tornadoes in the middle of winter, which was unheard of, bring into that sea level rise, which is just a matter of time. The Antarctic ice shelf is about to slide into the ocean. The Greenland ice shelf is on its way to become liquid. And the Gulf Stream there's a serious possibility that the Gulf Stream collapses and loses its influence over European weather, which means that Central Europe, there's a risk that Central Europe becomes, in its climate, similar to Labrador. Now, I'm not sure how many of you know where Labrador is. It's in northeastern Canada. Not quite as cold as Greenland, but sort of on the way. More like Iceland, perhaps. That's what Central Europe could become if the Gulf Stream becomes diverted. And the Gulf Stream can be diverted quite easily if the fresh water from the Greenland ice melt enters the North Atlantic. So that's a particular example of collapse. And it's entirely biogeographical kind of collapse. It doesn't have to do with economies or militaries or even human health, but downstream, all of those are severely affected. So emotional support, if you consider this scenario alone, people need emotional support, and under deep adaptation, that need is recognized, and there are some people who are in the business of devising means to provide some, well, collective support in the face of those prospects.
Do you want to mention Bendel's Lifeboats in this point for support?
Yeah. Refresh my memory. What did you?
Oh, somebody was asking about what Jim Bendel has referred to for lifeboats. I think Patty Michelle was asking the question.
Lifeboat ethics.
No, what he called the lifeboats, I remember him talking about that. Maybe we can pick that up a little bit later. I just thought that is part of the support that he has been saying. We have some lifeboats that we can use or that are available to us.
Lifeboats in terms of policies, helpful policies that if implemented
actions.
in time,
Yes.
yeah.
It might come up a little bit later.
One more like a moral lifeboat that I can see here among these points is the issue of empathy and solidarity with the earth. For me personally, and I guess I'm making this particular point a personal one, empathy and solidarity with the earth, meaning with the biosphere, the living part of the earth. Some people refer to it as Gaia, which I'm comfortable with, but not everybody is. But this kind of emotional solidarity with all life on this beautiful planet, that for me provides some emotional support. It is solidarity, but there's more to it than that. There's an emotional support in feeling that somehow life on Earth is likely to continue. Even if it looks very different in a few hundred years' time. And of course, a lot of species will be gone, but that happened before, even if it didn't quite happen so fast. This time, the sixth extinction is faster than any of the preceding ones, but never mind. The continuity of life on Earth provides me personally with some, well, consolation.
And that was part of the lifeboat idea.
I'm not sure if that qualifies as a lifeboat, but it doesn't make me feel slightly better than otherwise it would.
There is some criticism about that idea because only so many fit into a lifeboat. So there is a limited number of people that will survive. And we have to live with the fact that many, many will die. There
is such a thing as lifeboat ethics. Garrett Harding wrote a lot about that. And it's, again, a controversial concept because of what Sabina just mentioned. A lifeboat only has room for a limited number of people. Well, in a sense, everybody recognizes that a planet also only has room for a certain number of people. Depending on how they behave, that certain number can vary, but there are limits to everything in nature, including human populations. So in that sense, the lifeboat becomes a worry. Because, well, are we starting to throw people overboard? Sometimes we encounter people who are trying to throw others overboard. How do we react to that? And all of that. This is lifeboat ethics. And again, it's a little bit away from our topic, but it is an associated agenda and a concept that people have to engage with somehow and come to terms with it one way or another. So a lot of these, if you're thinking about lifeboats in terms of life preservation and consolation, they are in there, but implicitly. Just checking my notes if there's anything else. Support in general, it's emotional, but it's very much along the lines of human security. So of course, a lot of this is emotional and in terms of mental health, but support is also can be understood in terms of simple economic livelihood, basic human needs that are either accommodated or not in a particular scenario. So deep adaptation tries to find ways to provide that kind of support in many different respects. For me, as an educator, the aspect of critical thinking is really important. Critical thinking, in this case, with relinquishment, remember the question was, What ideas and values and aspirations do we have to get rid of because they no longer help or because they do more harm than good? So this requires critique. This required a critical inspection of ourselves and our own ideas about what constitutes progress, what constitutes a better world, what constitutes a happier humanity, flourishing humanity. Well, some criticism is in order with all these, and definitely not uncritical taking on board of ideas that belong into the 19th and 20th century. So critical thinking and how you teach it, for me as an educator, is a very important consideration. And we're battling with that every time we enter a classroom. History teaches nothing, says the man. We beg to disagree. We think we can learn a whole lot from history, a whole lot that can help us towards deep adaptation. If you have read anything by Jared Diamond, you know that in history, societies and cultures have faced collapse scenarios and have learned to either deal with that or not. And the consequences were, well, critical, to say the least. Anyway, Jared Diamond is the person to Google in that respect. But the study of history is, we consider it quite essential for deep adaptation thinking. Continuing.
Diane is saying, let's get rid of growth is good.
Yes, perfect example, Diane. Thank you.
Yeah.
That is something to relinquish, an idea to relinquish, that growth is good. Of course, there are certain aspects of growth that are important for deep adaptation too. For instance, growth in learning. And as a teacher, I really value it. But in general respects, growth is good. Yes, let's ditch it.
Infinite growth.
Okay. So a good ways into the workshop, I guess it is time to think about summary and objectives. And just to keep track of where we are in today's event, we went through an introduction to deep adaptation. Hopefully everybody by now has an idea what it's about and what it might mean for you individually. We went into reasons for engaging with deep adaptation and approaches and strategies, what can be done in its pursuit. And we are now reaching the point where we want to discuss some case examples in order to prepare ourselves for the group activity. There is one and maybe another one a little later where we deal with case examples and a particular case example that we've selected. And hopefully that will lead us into discussions and extensions and applications of deep adaptation for green policy specifically. And eventually, this is the long-term outcome that we're hoping for, that you develop some ideas for yourselves how to integrate deep adaptation into your perspectives of what sustainable development would mean for yourselves, what it ought to mean for humanities and Green Party policy specifically. Here is a picture of Jem Bendel and another person whose work has been quite fundamental to the idea of deep adaptation, as well as human security in the Anthropocene, is Dr. Bill Reese, who lives just across the water from here in Vancouver and works at UBC. So those two people deserve to be mentioned in this context. Case examples. Initially, we had three.
Can we just sort of ask maybe for questions at this point, if there are any more questions?
This
right
would
now, there's lots going on in the chat, but
okay.
Maybe just something that
what
somebody wants
out?
to. If anybody wants to add something, you can just speak up if you like, or send it through the chat. If there's anything right now, before we actually go to break. Yep. Okay.
I
So if
guess
you could
my
repeat-
question earlier about the individual or collective, I'm in Australia, but I am from the US. So when you said something about the individualism in the US, it sort of hit home pretty quickly. I just, here, my husband and I, we're trying to take on a lot of what you're saying. We're preparing. We know this is happening. We're not trying to say that we're not preppers in any way in terms of the violent sort of side that can come from that. But I can't see the Greens going out there. We're having such a hard time even saying that climate change is happening. We've got to prepare for it. How are we going to take that next step and say, not only have we got to prepare for it, but we're going to come out of this so different that we need to take steps to prepare for what the new living arrangement is going to be. COVID has had its impact on us. Here in Western Australia, not so much, but we're seeing what it's done to other people. And people adapted to that, but they're very reluctant to let go completely. I think we will come out of that with some differences. But climate change is just so slow. I mean, I'm sitting here while fires are burning in Western Australia. Two, significant sized towns of 4,000 or 5,000 people are being evacuated today because of the fire risk. And yet next week they'll go back and continue doing what they were doing last week.
Yeah, yeah. We see this as a race, and the race is between learning proactively, which, as you point out, is not nearly as fast as it could be. And the alternative is, of course, letting the Earth teach us, letting global change proceed without doing very much. But then, in retrospect, we will learn. We will say, oh, we should have done this. Oh man, why did we miss that? And especially, I think that there's heaps and heaps of politicians who will have to admit that they missed one opportunity after another. Now, we wouldn't be the kind of people who just blame politicians, but there are generally people in positions of leadership who will come to the realization that they should have in retrospect. So that's the alternative. Do we learn proactively, or do we learn retroactively? And as you say correctly, in a lot of cases, it'll probably be the latter, to our detriment.
Yeah. Hindsight.
Hindsight, yeah. Anything else from the chat?
Yeah. No, I think that's good.
Sorry, I
Okay.
raised my hand.
Go.
I just maybe come in. It's Ute.
Sorry, the audio isn't quite clear. Can you move closer to your microphone, perhaps?
Okay, this is Ute. Can I just follow up with a comment, which is basically also following on from Diane.
Right.
I also have a question about this sort of collective approach. It's, from my mind, not one of the problems is that it's not just politicians, as you just quite rightly said, who often sort of learn retroactively that they should have done something years and decades ago, but it's also voters who are unwilling in large enough numbers to vote for parties, including the Green Party, who would take a more proactive approach in all of this. For me, the question really is, in the collective side of things, it's not just parties and politicians and governments.
Yeah.
It's also collectively societies, how can we facilitate moving them forward in this thinking? Because that is, I mean, we Greens, from Green parties, we know what it's like to come out of elections, and even if you're in government, obviously you can't, in all cases, I know at least, not implement your election manifesto to 100%. So it's excruciatingly slow moving forward, and we're running out of time. So yes. How do we get speed into societies?
Yeah.
Excellent point. Thank you for this contribution. You've outlined very clearly how deep adaptation applies to individual thinking and individual decision making, and at the same time, and just as relevantly, to collective behavior, collective decision making, collective learning, which is something that we're at the moment working on. As an educator, I'm quite interested in collective learning, cultural learning, as we call it, because it usually involves cultural context within which that learning has to take place. And as Greens, of course, one aspect of that learning, as you noticed, is voter behavior and voter preferences, where this learning is painfully slow.
Yes. And here in Canada, especially.
Oh, Canada. Well, we have a disastrous electoral system, which really doesn't help at all. But even in countries where the electoral system is a lot better, such as Germany, many other European countries, Australia, New Zealand, electoral systems are, well, they're stellar compared to what we have in Canada. And still, voter behavior is lagging behind what we as Greens would see as progressive, a direction that we ought to go into. How do we deal with that? How can we affect that? Well, I'm thinking as individuals, it's always better to communicate, engage in conversations, which under conditions of social isolation is problematic. Yeah. But right now, I think we're all making a very good effort. Thank you for being here.
Yes.
This is the kind of communication that can only help.
And it's midnight for Ute in Germany.
Oh, so, man.
Yes. But we often do look to the Europeans for inspiration and for work that has been going on that we can only dream about here in British Columbia or in Canada. Our last 3 attempts at changing the electoral system to become actually representational and proportional have failed. And then our prime minister actually won in the last election by promising that he would actually introduce maybe mixed member participation or something similar, and then promptly moved backwards on that. So, which allowed him to win, not in a majority, but very close to it, with just about 30% of the voters in favor of Trudeau's Liberal Party. Yeah. So we're sitting here. We have won very often the dinosaur prize in many of the COP meetings because we're just making 1 step forward, 2 steps back. So I do hear what you're saying, Ute, but actually we are still way below what you have accomplished in Europe. So unfortunately, yes, we have a long way to go.
This is where electoral systems really directly play into deep adaptation, because an electoral system where you have multiple parties competing for party seats as well as individual seats in parliament, that facilitates the kind of discussion, public discussion, and thinking about the 4 questions of deep adaptation: resilience, relinquishment, restoration, reconciliation. All of those questions need to be discussed publicly and privately, of course. And they are more likely to have to encounter this kind of discussion in electoral systems that are more democratic, much more democratic than the Canadian, and I'm not even going to mention the US electoral system. Yes. But there are other examples in global politics where the electoral system is really not very helpful at all towards this kind of public discussion for deep adaptation.
So as an example, for Elizabeth May, who is actually speaking at a parallel session right now, is our member of parliament, like for us, for Alex and myself, where we live. She is our representative. But the Green Party has oftentimes actually managed to get more than 1 million votes. And still, she was the only lone star in in the parliament in Ottawa,
The federal parliament.
the federal in Ottawa, and she was the only Green member with 1 million people voting Green. So that's first past the post system. And there are only a handful of countries in the world that still hold on to the system.
That's 1 million votes out of what, 15 million eligible voters or
Yeah,
less?
maybe something like that, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm.
So
It's a
you can
federal
see
system.
this electoral system just sucks.
Yeah. Okay.
All right, it would be better in
Thank you
Germany,
for your question,
and it
Ute.
is better in Germany.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you for your question.
Yes, thank you. That was great, Ute. Anybody else from the chat before we move on?
I think for questions, yes, many countries, much of the world's population have no electoral system at all.
Yeah, true. There is that as well. So yeah, and we're not the worst off.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As life gets harder and harder, how do we keep voters? Do we keep voters from embracing lies and supporting charismatic fascists?
Populism. Yes.
Yes.
Well, of course, making such an effort would definitely help towards deep adaptation.
Mhm.
But how do we attempt this?
Yes.
To contravene and counteract populism, the influence of populist leaders who use fake news and misinformation in order to further their own agenda. Well, as an educator, again, I go back to critical thinking as an ideal, as a central skill, not just for deep adaptation, but for a whole lot of other democratic purposes,
Yes.
including criticism of inadequate electoral systems, but also criticism of certain political leaders and identifying their real agenda, helping individuals identify those agenda through their own critical thinking.
We've often spoken about introducing philosophy into the curriculum in primary school.
Curriculum design is central.
Yes.
Yeah, that's long term, of course. So, but that is one way.
Yeah. So there is no clear answer, I think. No tools.
Well, there's a multitude of tools, but they don't always deliver immediately.
Immediately, yeah. But as some people were pointing out, we're running out of time.
Yes.
So we are actually, that's why deep adaptation, I think, seems to be the way to go.
The whole assumption behind deep adaptation is that we've been running out of time for so long, it's too late for certain things. But never mind, we can still try avoid the worst.
4 degrees.
4 degrees.
Okay, thank you.
Case examples. Originally, we were thinking about 3, and of course 3 is way too many for a workshop. But here they are. The Extinction Rebellion movement at the bottom. Everybody's heard of it through the media because it's global.
And deep adaptation has worked with Extinction Rebellion.
Deep adaptation is right there because extinction.
Yeah.
Well, there's that really captures the idea of partial collapse, right? An extinction from the point of view of an extinct species. How much more collapsing can you do? So these are people who take on board the deep adaptation assumptions and agenda. The motto "Love and Rage" captures the associated emotions, and so that would have been a case example worth pursuing a little bit more. The Exarchaea in Greece example is just the opposite because it's extremely local. It deals with Mediterranean refugees and how they help themselves through constructive anarchism counteract and avoid the worst consequences for their own community in the refugee camp. Never mind, the one that we would like to pursue and introduce to you now is the example of an eco-village, an intentional community in southern India called Auroville. It has been in existence for several decades, and you may well have heard of them.
Almost 60.
The term eco-village is quite elastic. It includes examples of communities that are variously focused on.
Yes, Sabine, I'd still like to ask a question.
Oh, sorry. Yes,
Yeah.
please.
It's Tyrone. There's a question.
So,
Yeah.
thank you for the presentation. I came in late, but from what I've caught so far, it's been excellent. I'll be reading the PDF that you provided. I just wanted to ask, how do we as Greens change our mindset as well? Often we're very stuck in views that we have that go back a long time, and we haven't updated our views on with the most up-to-date science and things like that. Like I've been speaking with global meteorologists who are working with the renewable industry, and they're very concerned about a phenomenon called global stilling, which could see, global average wind speeds decline. We saw an event similar to that last year in Europe, where wind generation fell as much as 30% in some areas of Europe.
Mhm.
How do we potentially go from a 100% renewable outlook to a 100% decarbonisation outlook? I think decarbonisation needs to be the primary goal, rather than necessarily, our favorite little niche option that we might have seen on Facebook that looks, good in a meme, but might not necessarily have the evidentiary support behind it as a form to get to our final goal. I just, if you could maybe speak a little bit about how as Greens we can reflect ourselves on where we're going and where we've been, and the things that we can do.
Very relevant issue. Thank you for the question, Tyrone. As Greens, I think we need to keep in mind that addressing carbon balances and carbon footprints and carbon neutrality as an ideal does not entirely address the polycrisis of the Anthropocene. It really just addresses the issue of climate change. To what extent climate change is proceeding because we've passed tipping points is an open question anyway. But it's quite clear that if we became carbon neutral tomorrow, that the world would be less worse, in Vendel's lingo. So it's both a very relevant agenda point, but it's also only part of the solution under deep adaptation, namely to address the polycrisis in issues such as world hunger and health and economic issues and poverty and all of those things, which transcend climate change quite clearly. How to address particularly that issue that you've addressed? Well, again, I would think in the long term, it must be education of some sorts. And as Greens, of course, we are all in the business of inducing some kind of learning within our social sphere. In terms of green leadership, for countries where Greens are in the government, then
there are some.
There is that, and there are some, yeah, some very encouraging examples in last night's presentation. Anyway, that there's policy. All right, but what kind of policies could be enacted, particularly towards the goal of carbon neutrality? But keeping in mind, I think, and also constantly reminding people that this does not solve the whole problem. It solves part of it. It mitigates part of the problem. And that's how far I would go.
And perhaps on communication, what I would add to that is that too often we limit ourselves to speaking to those we know will listen to us. And oftentimes we don't get out of our comfort zone to talk to somebody who has probably never really been approached with these kinds of ideas. And we had this happen to us in demonstrations where we actually made an effort, a concerted effort, to go over to the other side, to stand close to these people.
The counter demonstration.
Yes, and initiate some sort of discussion. And then afterwards got into deep trouble with our group. It sounds terrible.
We were
group.
considered traitors.
Yes. Why did you speak to these people? Why? What were you doing over there? Like, what's wrong with you? So I think it is very important that just because some people might be conservative doesn't really mean that they would be against what you've been mentioning about, certain ideas and certain R&D and technological advances that are really important to address, and maybe we all agree that they would be a good thing. And what comes to mind right now, just quickly off the top of my head, is Angela Merkel making the decision to close down all the nuclear power plants in Germany after Fukushima. She's a conservative. She is probably very far away from what we Greens would consider to be in the net, like
or deeply adaptive.
Or deeply adaptive, yes, and yet she did stuff that we could not really foresee. That was an immediate.
A fantastic Canadian Prime Minister.
Yes.
Anyway,
she's actually out of a job right now, so maybe we could ask her.
But from the example, there's one aspect that I think directly addresses your question, Tyrone, and that is that we try and identify commonalities, common ideals, even between parties that explicitly disagree. So, okay, there's the party, the people who fight for carbon neutrality, and there are the people who, well, they want the coal industry to flourish, and they want the fossil fuel pipelines to continue in operation, and all of that. And there seems to be no middle ground between those two. Well, there is always middle ground, and perhaps sometimes we don't do quite enough to identify it, to explicate it, and to actually agree on things. In this case, the middle ground is the flourishing of life on Earth and the human species. That's what we all want, isn't it? Even if oil is identified as the means towards that flourishing, okay, we can disagree on the means, but surely we can agree on some of the ends and establish a better discussion climate at the very least.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tyrone.
Yes. Realize human unity. That's in the Orwell chapter or
Constitution?
Yeah, they have a constitution, I think. Anyway, there's a bit more information on the next slide. The City of Dawn, and there's a website with some information. 3,000 members from over 60 countries, 2,000 in general are there. No, 3,000 are there, and 2,000 move in and out as tourists and visitors.
And they're trying to get to 50,000.
Well, that is at the moment a point of discussion.
Right.
The map indicates that Oroville is located in the Indian state of Tamil Nadu. The little picture there shows you what the place looked like in 1968, when the first settlers, if you want to call them that, arrived and set about the monumental effort to recreate an environment, a pre-settlement environment of a lush tropical forest, which is the natural kind of ecosystem that existed there before people eradicated the forest and basically caused all sorts of problems with desiccation and soil, topsoil loss and whatnot. The challenges are listed here. The continuing ecological deterioration in all of southern India, Tamil Nadu more than Kerala, but still that is a challenge to be that an intentional community of this sort faced and had to somehow deal with. And under deep adaptation, of course, the collapse has already happened. Right, the topsoil is gone. You're now obliged to try and restore it somehow. Climate change, local climate change, that is in evidence. Pervasive poverty in the region. Tamil Nadu is one of the poorer states in India. And so it's not just a matter of creating a beautiful village, but helping the people around the village in the surrounding region and addressing some of the poverty issues and the crop failures that are a result of the climate change and the soil loss and all of that. COVID-19 has additionally created problems because migrant workers could no longer migrate and were locked into their native villages in the region, and Oroville felt obliged to help with that situation. And the last challenge it's more educational, namely that individual transformation. Of course, individual mindsets have to change and be adapted towards the ideal of Oroville, but also the system has to be adapted and transformed. So there's always that equilibrium and balance between individual learning and collective learning, individual action, collective action. And of course, both of them affect green policy. So that's an introduction to Oroville.
We need to move on.
There is another challenge, and that's been in the news only over the past month. Namely, they have encountered political dissent, political divisions. There is a fraction in Oroville who are going much more towards development, gung-ho modern type development, and there are others who resist that, and there has been even some violent confrontations. So that's not listed here under the challenges, but it is an additional one. All right.
Can I just say something there? It's something that religious communities have found over time, where I believe it's even in Canada, the Hutterites or whatever, where they'll get to a certain size and then realize they need to separate out and break off at another community. Because to have a really democratic society, once you get past 3,000, 4,000 people, I can imagine that would become very difficult. You'd go to a representative and then all of a sudden you're not being represented.
Yep. The democracy becomes more challenging the larger the group is. I think that it's almost a law of politics, and in history that quite often happened, as you pointed out, that innovative communities sometimes divided up and created satellite communities somewhere else, pursuing maybe a slight modification of the common agenda. That hasn't happened yet in Oroville. At the moment, the conflict is between different aspirations of development, the future development of the community. What we want to do in our group activity, is there a way that we can determine how many people are actually here?
17 at the
17. Okay, so
but there are more coming in all the time.
We could work in small groups, maybe 3 or so. Anyway, we've got the challenges listed on the left: ecological deterioration, climate change, regional, that is, regional poverty in the surrounding area, particular problems associated with the pandemic, and the balance between individual needs versus systemic transformation. As an additional challenge, there is political leadership and development policy that you could take into account. What we would like you to do once you're in your breakout rooms is find, or rather propose, policies that would address each one of these particular challenges. Now, you could concentrate on 1 or 2, or you could try and address all 5 or 6. That's up to you. The aid that you can use for this activity is the handout sheet that perhaps you've downloaded. And on the second page of the handout sheet, there's a table that has these 5 on the left as a column, and then with blanks on the right, where you can scribble in your ideas. Alternatively, you could type in your ideas if you have the document in electronic format. Either way, what we would like to have to receive at the end of the workshop is perhaps your photographs of the page, of the table, or email us a copy of the document with your ideas entered into. What we need to do in order to make this work is that in each group we have a note taker, somebody who takes this in hand, who has either nice handwriting or word processing skills, who would then be prepared to send us the result at the end of the group activity. That way, we think we can come up with a compilation of ideas that represent your thinking. And it's about time that we include your thinking rather than ours in this event here. So that's what we have in mind. We're thinking of using about 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we'll drop into the.
We'll try and circulate and monitor what's going on in the groups. If you're really stuck and don't have an idea what to do, please let us know through the chat or talk with us in the rooms. Let's see if I've left anything out, but I think we could make it work that way.
Okay. So I think you have the.
There is also the 4 agenda of deep adaptation that you could think about, but we will have some discussion about those 4 and to what extent your ideas conform with and take into account the 4 agenda points.
So are you saying we do this in relation to Oroville or the world in general? To Oroville.
Oroville is the example, and you don't need to know much about Oroville or southern India in order to come up with some ideas. For instance, you could look at the challenge of ecological deterioration in the region. Picture yourself as a citizen of Oroville. How would you counteract the ecological deterioration that was obvious at the time of inception in the 60s? Basically, it was a desert, savanna kind of desert. And you're aiming towards rainforest. Right? So 2 extremes. What would you do? How would you start? That's for the biologically oriented among you. Of course, you might not be interested in that. You could look at regional poverty and say, what would you do as a bunch of people from somewhere else who's now maybe constructed some homes in the initial village, and you're now encountering poverty all around you? Well, at what point would you start sharing? Obviously, you need to do something, pass something on in order to address the rampant poverty around you. What could be done? COVID-19, we all know countermeasures. So there's something easy to work with. You can see, you can use the Oroville example, but you don't have to know very much about it in order to come up with ideas to address these 5
green ideas.
Point ideas. Green ideas. Yeah, sure, we're all green. So don't come with economic growth and stuff like that. Yeah.
Endless.
We want to stay green.
Limitless. Increasing.
Yeah.
So
any other questions before we do this? Ideas to theirs. So with ecological deterioration, they tried, and of course, to restore. They used permaculture, they used crop rotation, and a lot of informed, innovative agriculture to restore the local ecosystem. For collapse and the prospect of it under deep adaptation, they had coffee meetings on the 4 questions of deep adaptation. Mostly young people. They collaborated with other communities on the challenges and found solutions together.
And they have this.
Ah, right. They are exporting industrial products sustainably produced. This is a toothpaste that we like, produced in Oroville. So this helps, of course, with the economy, the local economy. If you have something for export that can be produced sustainably and cleanly, that is the challenge. Collapse-ready action groups to head off possible negative outcomes. So in other words, they structured their community to prepare for action should it become necessary. With poverty, there was fundraising, organizing volunteers, listening groups, for especially focusing on these stranded migrant workers to help them out during the pandemic. And finally, in terms of political organization, they had citizen assemblies, learning groups, community outreach, and some of you address those in your groups. Basic democratic mechanisms to find common ground, to find common language, to exchange views and develop some kind of consensus that may then result in policy. So that was the plan, and for a long time it worked rather well for Oroville. At the moment things are a little bit less stable, but I'm sure with these things in place they're going to pull out of this crisis and make things work, as are hundreds and hundreds of eco-villages around the world. The question for us then, to what extent do these ideas and policies meet with or address the 4 agenda of deep adaptation: resilience, relinquishment, restoration, reconciliation? You can probably see the connections. Does anybody want to perhaps suggest a particular connection that stands out to them?
Hello.
Yeah.
For First Nations people in Australia, the term reconciliation has a loaded meaning, I think.
Yes.
And it refers to, obviously, you obviously, I would think most Greens would understand that it refers to the relationship, the historical and spiritual relationship between First Peoples and the country that you're on.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
So that's my connection, at least to the word and what it emotes for me. Yep.
Yep. Yep. Very relevant to any kind of post-colonial situation.
Yeah.
And that's more countries than you would think. Yep. Good contribution. Thank you.
With the relinquishment, I was just thinking in our group about how some of the ideologies that they set the group up for in the late 60s may have changed.
Yes.
And the people who set it up, who's now living there with their grandchildren possibly, may not want to see change.
Yeah.
So they've got to make those decisions about what from the past can they relinquish and what do they actually need to grab hold of. And following on from what Dominic said too, I was wondering if there was any people who have connection to the land in this group.
Yeah.
60 different countries, maybe not too many, but those people may have some sort of a connection historically to offer as to how to make it more ecologically resilient.
Excellent point. It's always easier to criticize others in their thinking and say, you have to relinquish this, rather than exploring your own assumptions and asking the question of how many of them are still valid. Yeah, excellent point. Thank you.
Can I just show, Rosalie was just asking about toothpaste and how to make them sustainably.
Yeah.
So this is, I don't know if you can see it. This is actually made out of cardboard, recycled cardboard. And it's a powder. It's not what you would consider regular toothpaste. It comes out as powder. And then you just mix it with a little bit of water and you just keep this one as dry as you can. But this is just recycled cardboard. And this is the top that goes on here. And that's the most sustainable, I think, that
Tooth powder
exists. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry for the interruption.
No, it's a great illustration.
Hello.
Okay. We're getting pretty close to to the closing. Yes. I'm trying to. Oops, sorry. There is just one slide here that's left. Where that I wanted to guide the proceedings a little bit back towards Green parties, and Green parties, what they do, whether they're in power or not, in terms of deep adaptation. And this we're going to have to leave you with these. This was originally intended as another group activity, but I think we've enjoyed the one, so we'll leave it at that. But this slide, it's a little bit open. What green parties do around the world, developing platform, developing forms of governance, reaching out to electorates and interacting with civil society. There's a lot of agenda there for deep adaptation. And this is something that you might regard as homework from this workshop. If you have ideas in those directions, please jot them down in addition to the notes from the group activity. Any kind of idea under these headings would be welcome. We will include them in the compendium that you will receive most likely by email or maybe posted under Hoover. I'm not sure how Millie intends to do that. But obviously we want to share our ideas as much as we can. So that's the plan.
So what about deep adaptation?
What
next?
Well, we want to
What are
make
your
the future
thoughts?
less worse, right?
Yeah.
So that's the umbrella idea.
So this is the last session in this 24-hour fast deep thinking.
The last
conference,
4 minutes.
The last 4 minutes
of the conference. Thank you for holding out.
Yes. Thank you for being here.
Sticking with it.
What do we want to? What is the thing that we want you to think about walking out of here?
Perhaps
closing shop.
an idea of what your Green Party could do in terms of deep adaptation that you would see a lot of benefit in.
Yes, yes. This almost didn't happen, deep adaptation, almost didn't happen because about 25 different publishers refused to publish the work on deep adaptation.
Yeah.
So that even the fact that we're sitting here was actually some kind of a subversive action on the part of one small publisher.
Yeah. Jem Bendel's paper is listed on the handout. It makes good reading, but he's encountered enormous difficulties with his idea. Anyway, would anybody like to provide a closing idea?
Maybe not an idea, just a challenge.
Okay.
I saw in the chat just from Patty Michelle that she's very concerned about preserving important scientific advancements, anatomy, surgery, antibiotics. Yes, but there's lots of things like technological, medical, whatever advances where I think this is lots of things that are technologically possible are not actually desirable, and they pose problems that we are either morally or ethically unable to resolve. So I think we would first of all need to find some kind of societal consensus about what we want to keep. So yeah, I'm glad there are antibiotics, but that's just one example where maybe we can agree. But you know, we would already with population in general get into an argument about whether vaccinations are sensible. Most of us believe they are, but certainly in some countries, including mine, there's a huge number of people who refuse to get vaccinated. So, and if we need that as a starting point before we take action, or before we start implementing it, then we already have a problem because we need to have this discussion first. Yeah.
Great idea. Thank you, Uta. If for anybody who wants to pursue this, Google Great Transition Network. Great Transition Network. It's been founded by a guy by the name of Paul Raskin. And there's an avid discussion among about 50 academics about exactly those questions. Great Transition Network.
Raskin, right?
So I think we've pretty much reached the end. I'm sorry, Uta got the
will-
last word.
We will keep the emails. Can we get the emails of the chat?
The chat,
For
yeah,
us.
we'll try and post the chat contents
Yes.
as well as your notes and ideas. And we thank you.
Yes.
But sorry,
much.
could you still go to your last slide, because we need your email address.
Yes.
Yes.
Email you the
Thank you.
note.
Actually, the slides will be posted as well, but here they are.
Oh, okay.
But if I
Great.
could also say that we've been working for quite a long time in a whirlpool of all sorts of difficulties, because we have ideas that are not easily acceptable. And when we publish, we often have to really push hard to get the ideas out, because some of the discussions and debates that we like to see in the public domain and in mainstream are always just a little bit outside the box. So to have you guys here and to talk with us about deep adaptation and to listen to human security and to just work on this idea that what next, you know, that there is something that comes next. There is another step after this, and you're going to take it out there and put it into the green context. We've been green members for 38 years or something like that. And it seems that we keep on talking about the same issues and the same issues.
But at least everybody here is outside a box.
Yes.
Which is a nice common ground
Thank
to feel
you for
on.
that.
Yeah, so thank you for that.
Yeah, it feels really good. Yes, gives hope.
Get home safely.
Yes, and please stay in touch.